chained but not killed for 12 long years. A Lakota chief broke the chain and stayed with her. The iron was cold the morning they put it on. That's the thing I remember clearest, not the soldiers, not the interpreter who wouldn't look at me, not the long walk from the treaty council to the wagon. The cold of that iron cuff. It was October. The Missouri breaks were the color of old bone, and the iron on my wrist was so cold it felt wet, felt like touching a creek stone pulled from deep water. My name is Chayton Eagleheart. My father called me the Falcon. I was 34 years old, and I had led my band through 2 seasons of raids, 2 seasons of holding the treaty line, and 1 season of watching the Bluecoats come across the river anyway. The agent at the fort told Washington I had broken the peace. He told them I was a war chief making trouble. He did not tell them about the cattle his men had taken, or the 2 young men of my band they had shot for crossing a creek. That is how a man ends up in a wagon with iron on his wrist going east, while his people stand on a hill watching until the dust swallows the road. I will not tell you about the 12 years as if they were one long thing. They weren't. They were 12 separate years, each one its own kind of weight. The first year was the fort, a room with a log wall and a dirt floor and a window the size of a man's spread hand. They fed me twice a day, and in the evenings an officer sometimes came and read to me from a Bible in English. I did not speak English then. He read it anyway. I think he believed it did something. The second year they moved me east to a brick building in a city I did not know. There were others there, a Cheyenne man, 2 men from a nation I had not heard of before, an older Osage who had been held longer than any of us. The Osage was a quiet man who had taught himself to read English from a newspaper they brought him once a week. He taught me some words, not many, enough to understand when they were lying to me, which was most of the time. The third year a lawyer from back east came and argued that I should be released. He was a small man with a pointed beard, and he spoke with great fire. Nothing happened. He came back the next year with a different argument. Nothing happened again. He stopped coming after that. The fourth year the Osage died. Pneumonia. He died on a Tuesday in March, and by Thursday his bunk had a new man in it. I don't know what happened to his newspaper. Year 5 through 7 are the ones I have the hardest time pulling apart. They blur. I know I was moved again. A different building, a different city, colder winters. I know I stopped expecting things. That is the worst that happened, not any one bad day, but the morning I woke up and understood that I was no longer waiting for anything. A man who is waiting is still alive in some way that matters. A man who has stopped waiting is something else. I kept myself going the way you keep a fire going in wet weather. Small, careful, don't let it go out. I made a calendar on the wall behind my bunk using a nail I found in the floor. I marked the days, not because it changed anything, because it was a way of saying, I am still counting. I am still here and I am still counting. Year 8 a woman came. Not to see me, not at first. She was brought in to interpret for the Cheyenne man who had been held even longer than I had, a man called Standing Elk, who had been taken before me and would, as things turned out, be taken by sickness before he ever got free. Her name was Winona Morningsky. She was Lakota, from a band to the north of mine, and when she walked into that room I knew her nation the way you know a song your grandmother sang, not from memory exactly but from something deeper than memory, from the back of the throat. She was maybe 26 or 27 years old. She wore her hair in 2 braids and a white woman's dress, and she moved in that dress like it was a costume, like her real self was underneath it somewhere waiting. She had come from one of the mission schools, and she spoke English like a woman who had learned it well enough to be suspicious of it. Like she knew which parts of the language didn't have Lakota underneath them, and she kept a distance from those parts. She talked to Standing Elk for an hour while a clerk wrote down everything. When she was done, she turned to go and she looked at me, just a look. The way you look at someone you recognize and then realize you don't. She went on. The door closed. I thought about that look for 3 weeks. She came back the following month to interpret for a different man, a Sioux who'd been brought in from Dakota. She came back after that for 2 more men. Each time she walked through the room, and each time, I don't know why, she found a reason to pause near my bunk. Not to talk, just to pause. Once she dropped a folded piece of newspaper, and when I picked it up she was already looking the other way, but I understood that she had dropped it for me. It was a short piece from a St. Louis paper about a petition being circulated by a church group, asking for review of the cases of certain held Indian men. My name was in it. Chayton Eagleheart, Lakota war chief. The writer called me a man of complicated circumstances, and said the original accusations against me were being questioned by several officers who had since left the territory. I read that sentence until the paper went soft from handling. She brought me 3 more pieces over the next 4 months. She was careful. She never spoke directly to me when anyone was watching. She had the kind of caution that comes from having learned what happens to a woman who moves wrong in a room full of men who hold the keys. But there came a night in late autumn, I think year 9 by then, though I had lost a few of my nail marks in a move and wasn't fully certain, when she was kept late because her interpreter work had run long, and the guard who usually walked her out to the street had gone off duty without being replaced, and she stood in the corridor outside the cells waiting for someone to come. I could see her through the bars, just her back, the set of her shoulders. I said her name, Winona. She didn't startle. That told me she'd known I was there. She turned and came to the bars and stood a foot away and looked at me straight in the face. She had dark eyes with a lot of light in them, the kind of eyes that make you feel like you're being weighed, except it doesn't feel bad. It feels like the weight means something. She said, "I have been reading about you since before I came here." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because I wanted to know what kind of man they were holding this long and not killing." I didn't have an answer for that. I thought about it for a moment and then I said, "I think they weren't sure what to do with me." She said, "Or they were afraid of what would happen if they did." She had sharp edges, Winona Morningsky. She had been shaped by hard things and she had come out of them with her spine straight. Not bitter, there's a difference. Bitter is when the hurt turns inward and sours. She had turned hers into something harder and cleaner, like a blade that's been hammered too many times and finally just becomes good steel. The guard came and she went. The next time she came, she brought me a small piece of dried meat wrapped in cloth, pushed through the bars fast while the clerk was distracted with his paperwork. The time after that she told me, quietly, mouth barely moving, that she had spoken to the lawyer with the pointed beard, who was back, who had found new arguments, who wanted to know if I was still alive and still sound enough to be worth fighting for. I said to her, "Why are you doing this?" She took a moment with that question. She looked at the floor and then back at me. She said, "Because someone should have done it sooner, and because I know what it looks like when a man is being ground down on purpose, and I know what kind of man keeps himself from being ground." That was the first time I felt something move in me that I hadn't felt move in years. Not hope exactly, something below hope, the thing that has to be alive before hope can come. The lawyer's new arguments didn't work that year, or the next. I was at 12 years by then, 12 winters, if you count the way I counted, each one scratched on a wall in a city 1,000 miles from the Missouri breaks. And then Winona did something that I did not expect, and that I will tell you straight because there is no other way to tell it. She testified. In front of a congressional committee hearing on Indian prisoners, she stood up and she spoke. I was not there. I was told about it later by the lawyer. He said she spoke for 40 minutes without notes. She told them about her visits to the facility. She told them what she had seen. She described Standing Elk, who had died by then, and 2 other men who had also died. She described me not as a war chief, not as a complicated circumstance, but as a man. She said, "Chayton Eagleheart has been held for 12 years on accusations that 3 separate military officers have since disputed, in conditions that would break most men, and he has not been broken because he is made of something that this country does not deserve but that it desperately needs. She said, "I am asking you to open the door." The lawyer said there was a silence in that room when she finished that lasted a full half-minute. It took another 8 months after that. There were papers, reviews, more papers, an argument about jurisdiction, more papers. But they opened the door. I remember the morning clearly in the way you only remember mornings that are the first of something. April. Not warm yet, but the kind of cold that has some give in it, that knows it's losing. They walked me through a hallway and out a door and into a courtyard and across the courtyard and through a gate, and there was the street. Winona was there. She was standing on the other side of the gate with the lawyer and 2 other men I didn't know. She was wearing a blue coat and her hair was in 1 braid instead of 2, and she looked like she had been there a long time and was going to stay as long as it took. I walked through the gate. I don't know what I looked like. I know I was thin. I know my hair was long and had gone gray in a streak above my left ear that hadn't been there when I went in. I know I had not been on open ground in over 2 years. I stopped a few feet in front of her. The lawyer was talking. I didn't hear what he said. Winona looked at me, and then she stepped forward and she put both of her hands on either side of my face. Just her palms, flat, warm. The way you hold something you have been worried about and need to confirm is real. And she held me like that for a moment while the lawyer's voice went on somewhere in the background. She looked at me with those dark eyes that weighed you without making you feel bad about it, and she said, quiet, just for me, "You stayed." I said I stayed. She said, "I knew you would." That was the whole conversation. It was enough. The months after that were not easy. I won't lie to you and say freedom is simple after 12 years. It isn't. The world had moved and I was still in a body that expected iron. I startled at things. I had trouble sleeping in a room without walls I could touch in the dark. There were mornings when I woke up and for a few seconds didn't know where I was, and the fear that hit me was so thick I couldn't breathe. Winona knew. She didn't make a thing of it. She just stayed close in the way that practical people stay close, not hovering, not asking how you feel about everything every hour, but there, making coffee in the morning, leaving a light on. Finding things that needed doing so I had something to put my hands to. Because a man who has been held still needs to be needed, and she understood that without being told. We went back west in the summer. It took months of arrangements, and not all of it went smooth. There were people who did not want me returned to my territory. There were hearings and conditions put on the return, and a long argument about where exactly I could go. Winona navigated all of it with that careful anger of hers, not loudness, not drama, just a woman who knew which doors to knock on and how to knock. The band that had waited, and some of them had, the older men and women, the ones who had not scattered or been moved to other places, they were in the breaks above the river when we came. I saw them from a distance first, which is how the planes work. You see people from a long way off and you have time to understand what you're seeing. I recognized the way they sat their horses. I recognized the color of one man's blanket. I stopped my horse on the ridge and just looked down for a while. Winona stopped beside me. She didn't say anything. She knew what this was. I was 46 years old. My hair was half gray. My hands, which had once known how to do everything, how to read a trail, how to dress a buffalo, how to find water in the dry places, had spent 12 years forgetting, and now were going to have to remember. I wasn't the same man who had ridden out to that treaty council. I knew that. Some things the years take, they don't give back, and you don't get to be angry about it. It is just the price. But I was still a man. I was still Chayton Eagleheart, which is not nothing. I was still the man who had kept counting when there was nothing to count toward. And I had beside me a woman who had stood in front of a committee of men who held all the keys and spoken for 40 minutes without notes on my behalf, and who had then stood outside a gate and waited as long as it took. I put my horse forward, and we rode down to meet them. There are things I could tell you about the years after, How we built something. How the band slowly found its shape again. Not the old shape because that was gone, but a new one that still had the old things in it. The knowledge, the way of moving through that country, the ceremonies that we kept even in the hard years when everything said stop. I could tell you about the winter 2 years after my return when the storms came early, and we were short on everything, and I spent 4 nights with the other men keeping the horses calm and the camp intact, and how that felt in my body like something plugging back in, some current that had been cut and was now flowing again. I could tell you how Winona and I were married in the spring of that second year, in the way of our people, with the old words and her grandmother's trade blanket around her shoulders and the whole camp watching. How her eyes looked that morning, not soft, because Winona was never soft, but open in a way I had not seen them open before, like something had been decided, and the deciding felt right. But I think what I want to tell you is a smaller thing than all of that. There is a ridge above the camp where I go sometimes in the early morning when the sky is just starting to show color. You can see the river from there, and the breaks on the far side, and the long flat country to the south where the light comes up slow and pink before the sun is even visible. It is the same country it always was. The grass is the same. The river is the same. The hawks come up on the same thermals they have always used. One morning last fall, Winona came up the ridge behind me. I heard her step. She's light-footed, always has been, but on loose shale you hear anybody. She came and stood beside me without asking if I wanted company, which she has never done because she has always known the answer is yes. The sky was going pink and gold above the breaks. The river was a dark line below. The camp was still quiet. She put her hand in mine. Not a dramatic thing. Just her hand finding my hand the way it does now, from having done it 1,000 times. We stood there watching the light change. I have thought over the years about what she said when I walked through the gate. You stayed. As if my staying in that place through those 12 years was a thing I had done rather than a thing that had been done to me. But I have come to think she was right. There were men who didn't stay, men who broke, men who went somewhere inside themselves and never came out. Men who died not from disease but from giving up. I stayed because I counted the days on the wall with a nail. Because I read her folded newspapers until they came apart. Because somewhere in me there was a thing that said, not yet, keep the fire small, don't let it go out. She saw that thing. She is the one who saw it and decided it was worth fighting for. That is the gift a woman gives a man when she gives it freely and not because she has to, not rescue, not pity, but the plain decision that this is a man worth standing beside. That this fire, small as it is the one she wants to tend. The sun was coming up now over the eastern breaks. The pink was turning gold and the gold was turning white, the hard clear white of a plains morning with no clouds and a west wind. The camp below us was waking up. I could smell smoke from the first fire someone had lit. I held her hand and watched the light take the country. 46 years old when I walked through that gate. I am 58 now. My hands remember what they forgot. The gray in my hair has spread, but it doesn't bother me the way it might have once. A man who has kept himself alive through 12 years of being ground down does not trouble much over gray hair. The Falcon, my father called me. I used to wonder, in that brick building in that city far from home, if the name still fit. A falcon in a box is just a bird in a box. It forgets its wings. But you let a falcon loose on open ground, and it remembers fast. The wind came up off the river. Winona's hand was warm in mine. I watched the country wake up and felt, for the 10,000th morning in a row, like a man who has come back to himself and been given something more than he had before. Not because the 12 years were good, they were not good, I will not make them good in the telling, but because on the other side of them was this ridge, this river, this woman, this morning. Some things you can only earn the hard way. That is not wisdom I would have chosen, but I will take what I earned. The sun was fully up now, and the country was bright. I squeezed her hand once and she squeezed back, and we stood there a while longer, and then we went down to the camp.